The King in the Snow. Heinrich sat alone in his chamber, the weight of a crown he was no longer allowed to wear pressing heavily on his mind. He was the king of the Germans, the Holy Roman Emperor, yet with a single stroke of a pen, Pope Gregory VII had cast him out. Excommunication was a death sentence for his authority. His lords were already whispering of rebellion, and his friends were vanishing like shadows at noon. To save his throne, Heinrich knew he had to do the unthinkable. He had to find the Pope and beg for a forgiveness he wasn't sure he felt. The journey would not be an easy one. It was the dead of winter, 1077, and the Alps stood like a wall of ice between Heinrich and the Italian fortress of Canossa, where the Pope was staying. Heinrich called for his most trusted companion, Eberhard, to prepare the horses. "The princes are gathering," Heinrich said, his voice tight with urgency. "If I do not reach Pope Gregory VII before the spring thaw, I will have no kingdom to return to." Eberhard nodded, already reaching for the maps, knowing that the mountain passes were treacherous, even for the bravest men. The climb through the mountains was a nightmare of white and gray. The wind howled through the narrow passes, threatening to sweep them into the abyss. Heinrich and Eberhard led their horses by the reins, their boots sinking deep into the frozen crust of the snow. Every step was a battle against the elements, but Heinrich's desperation burned hotter than the cold. He had traded his royal silks for heavy wool, and his pride for a singular grim purpose. At last, the jagged peaks gave way to the rolling hills of Tuscany. High above the clouds, perched on a rocky crag, sat the fortress of Canossa. Its walls were thick and its gates were barred. Heinrich stood at the base of the slope, looking up at the high towers. He was exhausted and ragged, looking more like a common pilgrim than a king. The journey across the Alps had been won, but the real battle, the battle of wills, was only just beginning. Inside the warm, torchlit halls of the castle, Pope Gregory VII sat with the powerful Countess Matilda. "He is here," Matilda whispered, looking out a narrow window at the lone figure below. Gregory VII, a man whose resolve was as hard as the stones of his fortress, did not move. "Let him wait," the Pope replied. He challenged the authority of the Church. A king must learn that even his power has limits. Matilda looked concerned, her hand resting on the cold stone of the windowsill as she watched the blizzard begin to swirl again outside. Heinrich did not retreat to a nearby village or seek shelter from the storm. To prove his penance, he stripped away his boots and his warm outer cloak. He stood in the courtyard of the castle, barefoot in the snow, wearing only a simple wool tunic of a monk. The first day passed in a blur of shivering and silence. He watched the sun dip below the horizon, the ice biting into his skin, but he did not move from the gate. By the second day, the cold had moved from his skin to his very bones. High above on the ramparts, Matilda watched him through the falling flakes. She had seen kings in their glory, but she had never seen a man endure such humiliation for the sake of power. She felt a flicker of pity for the shivering man below. Heinrich looked up and saw her silhouette against the gray sky, a silent witness to his suffering. He knew his life and his crown depended on the mercy of those behind the walls. On the third day, Matilda could no longer stay silent. She knelt before Pope Gregory VII in the castle chapel. "The man has suffered enough," she pleaded. "If he dies at your gates, the world will see you not as a shepherd, but as a tyrant. He has humbled himself before God and before you." Gregory VII looked at the crucifix on the wall, the silence of the chapel stretching long between them. Finally, he gave a slow, measured nod. "Open the gates," he commanded. The heavy iron bolts groaned as the gates of Canossa finally swung open. Heinrich, barely able to walk, stumbled into the inner courtyard. Pope Gregory VII stepped out from the shadows of the great hall. The king fell to his knees in the slush, the ice melting against his worn tears. "Holy Father," he rasped, his voice cracked from the cold. Gregory VII approached him, not with a scepter, but with a hand extended in a gesture of peace, the excommunication was lifted, and for a brief moment, the world of power and politics stood still. Heinrich left Canossa with his crown secured, but he was a changed man. He had learned that the highest mountain was not the Alps, but his own pride. As he and Eberhard began the long walk back to the German lands, Heinrich looked back at the fortress on the hill. He had won his kingdom back from Pope Gregory VII, but the struggle between the crown and the cross would continue for generations. He had survived the snow, but the winter of his reign was far from over.